We're here tonight to do some work with the Slavonic Josephus. Now, what is that? I'm going to explain that to you. Before Josephus wrote the Greek version of the Jewish War, the one that's so familiar today, Josephus tells us that he wrote it first in Aramaic. With him writing in that language, we can be fairly sure that he was not directing the work toward Romans or Greeks, but toward Jews and probably those in the dispersion. For this very reason, we might expect that he would be choosy in what he wrote. It might be his life at stake, putting more content in that the Romans would be interested in and leaving out what would offend them. And we can see in his common version, which I'm sure that you've all read or are familiar with to some extent, that he's very deferential toward his new Roman masters, softening up the stories of the war that might surely have offended them. And you know that he took the surname of the emperors and the generals that were working their way through Israel, that is Flavius. So he calls himself Flavius Josephus. The Aramaic version disappeared, though, entirely. We suppose Josephus would be glad for that in the 25 years he lived after he wrote it, probably around 71 AD, right after the fall of Jerusalem. We know that because he writes about Masada as an addendum to what he already wrote. Masada happened, I believe, in 73. In 1866, a hitherto unknown version of the Jewish War was discovered, of all places, in Russia. Several copies there, several manuscripts. The earliest of those manuscripts dates to 1463. The language of the manuscript was a mystery, but it was similar to that of the old Russian chronicles. An English translation, it hasn't been available until just recently, only with the publication of the book by Robert Eisler from 1931, titled The Messiah Jesus. Finally, a definitive comparison of the texts of the Greek and Slavonic versions in synoptic form were translated into English and now available by Leeming and Leeming, published by Brill in 2003 as Josephus' Jewish War and its Slavonic version. Eisler's book, The Messiah Jesus, went out of print years ago, and Leeming's book is very expensive and hard to find. And I wonder why. I wonder why we haven't had an English translation of these important documents in all this time. And still, we don't have it all. I just wonder why. But in the last couple of weeks, I've been able to acquire both these books in PDF form. In fact, Leeming's book, I actually got that in interlibrary loan. Look how wide that thing is and full. And maybe you can see, maybe you can't, but I got it upside down. It's synoptic in that the two texts are shown together, the Greek and the Slavonic. A lot of information in here and in Eisler's books too. If you're interested in having those on PDF, as I said, I have them now. I'm just starting to get into them. I've already found some major points of sensation regarding what they reveal about the times and the characters of the New Testament, as well as the Apocrypha. And I'm working now toward completing a version that's inexpensive and easy to get for strange people like myself, maybe like you, who want to delve into this kind of provocative literature. But three questions need to be resolved. One, is the Slavonic Josephus a translation of the Aramaic that disappeared? Two, if so, how did it get to Moravia and Russia? Moravia being the land around what we would call the Czech Republic today. And three, is it authentic Josephus? After much thought in regards to how it got to Moravia, I have come up with a theory. That theory has to do with a couple of brothers who lived in the 9th century. Perhaps you've heard of them. They're both Anglican and Catholic saints. They are Kiril and Methodius. They both were born around 1820. I should say 820, not 1820. A little bit about that, Kiril and Methodius. A decisive change in their lives occurred when the Duke of Moravia asked the Eastern Emperor Michael for political independence from German rule and ecclesiastical autonomy. That is, having their own liturgy and clergy. And I believe that in that time, we had the Holy Roman Empire, which was centered in Germany. Kiril and Methodius undertook a missionary task to go there. And Kiril was an expert in the Aramaic language. He certainly took lots and lots of Aramaic texts with him to share with these people in Moravia. But his first work had to be to invent an alphabet, because they had no written alphabet or writing up there in the vernacular of the people, Slavic type languages. That alphabet is actually named after him, the Cyrillic or Cyrillic alphabet that's still used in some Eastern liturgies, and that has evolved into Russian and the other Slavic languages, still using primarily that alphabet. Together, Methodius and Kiril, they translated the Gospels, the Psalter, Paul's letters, and the liturgical books into Slavonic, which that's what their language is called, and composed a Slavonic liturgy, which was highly irregular then. And another source tells me that they took scads of Aramaic text, as I said before, with them, since Kiril was an Aramaic expert. That and their free use of the vernacular in preaching led to opposition from the German clergy. Of course, they were only to preach and write in Latin at that time. The bishop refused to consecrate those Slavic bishops and priests, and Kiril was forced to appeal to Rome. On that visit to Rome, he and his brother Methodius had the joy of seeing their new liturgy approved by Pope Adrian II. Kiril, who was a long invalid, he died in Rome. Methodius then had to go back to Rome to defend himself against charges of heresy and uphold his use of the Slavonic liturgy. He was again vindicated. Legend has it that in a feverish period of his activity, Methodius translated the whole Bible into Slavonic in 8 months. Now, my theory based on fact here is that Kiril took with him a copy of the Slavonic, or I should say the Aramaic Josephus. And when he got up there, He translated it into the new language with the new alphabet, and it's been moldering up there until it was found about 1860, all those many years. So if the Aramaic version has disappeared, this is a grand possibility that it's appeared again in this Slavonic version. And of course, the scholars fight over that, and it seems like in some of their debates about it, the reason it seems that they don't want that thing coming out is because it talks at length about some of the people in the New Testament that we know. It also talks a lot about Jewish history in the years before Messiah, in the first century BC and a little second century. These passages aren't found in other versions of Josephus. I've edited them here for language and clarity. Note that as I go through, they are not lifting stories out of the New Testament, but they're standalone witnesses to what had occurred 30 years before, assuming the Jewish war was written in 71 AD. My intention here is to read these passages to you so I can also record them for podcast, but at the same time, I have a written out text with pictures that if you'll remind me toward the end, I'll upload them there for you, and you can bring them down and keep this text if you want to, because it's a very close translation to what the Slavonic is. This section, a wild man is accused and accuses, and prophecy of unspeakable calamity. At that time, a certain man was going about Judea in strange garments. He put the hair of cattle on those parts of his body that were not covered with his own hair. He was wild looking. He came to the Jews and called them to freedom, saying, Elohim has sent me to show you the lawful way by which you will be rid of your many rulers. There will be no mortal ruling, only the Most High who has sent me. When they heard this, the people were glad. All those of Judea and the environments of Jerusalem were following him. He did nothing else for them but to dunk them in Jordan's stream and dismiss them, bidding them refrain from their lawless acts. Then a king would be given them to save them. He would be humbling all the unsubmissive, as he himself would be humbled by no one. Some mocked his messages, but others believed them. And when he was brought before Archelaus, when the experts of the Torah were assembled, they asked him who he was and where he had been up until now. Here's a note. Archelaus was a son of Herod the Great. He was after after Herod died, Archelaus took over his kingship of Palestine. But in 6 AD, Archelaus was deposed by the emperor on account of his cruelty. And in the regular Josephus, there's quite a bit about Archelaus there and why he was deposed, sent into exile. Following him were three other sons of Herod the Great, Antipas, Philip, and another one I'm not thinking right now, that came and took over. They split that area up into three different kingdoms, or they called it a tetrarchy, and gave each one of those members of the Tetrarchy while Archelaus was gone. What's important about this is that Archelaus was deposed in 6 AD, not 30-something AD. So what is happening here is that this wild man was active way, way before 30 AD. In answer, he said, I am but a man. I go wherever the divine spirit leads me. I feed on the roots of reeds and the shoots of trees. When these people threatened him with torture if he didn't cease those words and acts, he said, it is you who should cease from your foul acts and adhere to Yahweh, your Elohim. Of course, in the text, there's some word like the Lord in there. I could not read the Slavonic because it's not in there, just the parallel Greek and Aramaic. But there is the word Lord in there in capital letters, so I'm assuming that's a sacred name. Then arising in fury, Simon, an Essene by origin, a scribe, said, we read the divine scriptures every day, and you who have now come in like a beast from the woods, dare teach and lead the people astray with your disrespectful words. And Simon rushed forward to tear his body apart. But he, that is the wild man, reproaching them, said, I am not revealing the mystery that is here among you to you. So an unspeakable calamity will come down upon you because of you, and all the people have not wished to hear. And so he spoke and left for the other side of the Jordan. And since no one dared to prevent him, he continued doing just as he had done previously. See, this doesn't even fit in with the New Testament account. That's why it ought to be considered authentic, because there's a significant time difference here between the New Testament and this particular wild man. Next section, Phillips' dream and interpretation. When his domain had been taken away from Archelaus, Caesar Augustus handed it over to his own governors. But Philip and Antipas, surnamed Herod, held their tetrarchies and founded many cities for Caesar, including Julius and Tiberius, in honor of Tiberius. Philip, while being in his own domain, saw in a dream an eagle tear out both his eyes. And he called together his wise men. And when others were resolving the dream otherwise, the man we have already described as walking about in animal hair and cleansing people in the streams of Jordan came to Philip suddenly without being summoned, and he said, got to make a correction here. And he said, hear the word of Yahweh. The dream you have seen, the eagle is your aggressive greed. For that bird is violent and avaricious, as is your sin. It will pluck out your eyes, which represent your domain and your wife. Remember, Philip is in the New Testament. And now we'll pick up here something that occurred and written up in the New Testament that you'll recognize. Once he had spoken this way, Philip passed away by evening, and his domain was given to Agrippa. His wife Herodias was taken by Herod Antipas, his brother. Because of her, all those who were learned in the Torah detested him, but did not dare accuse him to his face. Only that man, they called the wild man, whom we call Yochanan, Yahweh's dunker, came to him in fury and said, "Since you, lawless ones, have taken your brother's wife, just as your brother died a merciless death, so you also will be cut down by the sky's reaping hook. For divine providence will not remain silent, but will be the death of you through grievous afflictions and in other lands, because you are not raising seed for your brother, but satisfying your carnal lust and committing adultery, since there are already 4 children of his own." Evidently, the problem here is with the Levitical idea of raising up children rather than anything else. And hearing this, Herod was enraged and ordered him to be beaten and thrown out. Yochanan, however, did not cease, but whenever and wherever he encountered Herod, he spoke this way, accusing him until Antipas put him away in a dungeon. His character was strange, and his way of life not that of a normal human being, for he existed just like a bodiless spirit. His mouth knew not bread, nor did he even taste the unleavened bread of Passover, saying that it was in remembrance of Elohim, who had delivered the people from servitude, and that the journey was urgent. Wine and fermented liquor he would not allow near him. He detested all animal flesh. He denounced all injustice, and for his needs there were tree branches. Another version says tree buds. The next section we'll go over is Pontius Pilate. And this comes not from the Slavonic version, but from another version of the Antiquities, the second edition, which is another text that you cannot get anymore. Pilate was by birth a Gaulian of the city of Levdania. The name of that city is pretty interesting. Levdanya, Dan the snake, Levite, Levi. Nobody knows exactly where that is, but it may have been Vienna or somewhere near Lyon, France. And Pilate was appointed chief voivode. That was a hard word to try to find what it meant, but I finally found it on a Slav page. That was an old military commander, and they still call them that, voivod or voivod, because he had conquered many provinces. Wherefore he was sent to Jerusalem as a governor in the place of Valerius, who was deposed because he had accepted bribes from Ishmael, whom he had named high priest in the place of Simeon, removed by him. He was a follower of Eleazar, who was succeeded by Enos and Caiaphas. All right, Eleazar, that's Eleazar the priest, succeeded by Enos, that is Annas, and Caiaphas, of course, is Caiaphas. Pilate brought to Jerusalem the image of the Emperor Tiberius and demanded for it divine honors. The Jews refused to admit the image and to sacrifice to Caesar. Then Pilate brought a huge Roman army to Jerusalem and killed many of the Jews. Ever since that time, Pilate was a governor feared by the Jews. I was amazed to find that there's an actual statue of Pontius Pilate, and I've got a picture of it in here. Pontius Pilate and the Samaya. A governor was sent by Tiberius to Judea, who secretly brought into Jerusalem by night the image of Caesar or Kaiser called the Samaya, and he set it up in the city. And when morning came and the Jews saw it, they were horrified and raised a great tumult at the sight of their Torah being trampled upon, for no image is allowed in the city. The people from round about all came running in haste, and they heard what had happened. They hurried to Caesarea, imploring Pilate to remove the Samaya from Jerusalem, for he had formerly allowed them to maintain their ancestral customs. When Pilate ungraciously rejected their pleas, the Jews fell prostrate and endured 5 days and 5 nights without moving from there. So Pilate mounted the throne in the great hippodrome and summoned the people, as if wishing to give answer to them, and he ordered his troops, armed with their weapons, to surround the Jews suddenly. And they, seeing the unexpected sight of 3 regiments surrounding them, trembled greatly. Pilate threatened them and said, "I will have you all cut down if you do not accept the image of Caesar." Then he ordered his men to draw their swords. Resigned, the Jews fell, and stretching out their necks cried, "We are ready to be like sheep for slaughter rather than transgress the Torah." And Pilate was amazed at their fear of Elohim and their purity. So he ordered the Samaya, to be removed from Jerusalem. Now, I only found that word Samaya in the Slavonic version, no place else. And I'm wondering what that is, what that word means. And I just looked at the way it was spelled, and I thought this might be like the Greek semeia, which means signs, the same word used in John 2:23. This was the first of the signs he did and all. And then I thought about the Hebrew Shemiah, which that couldn't be right. Yah is my name. Also means he who hears Yah. And I put this up on Facebook in the think tank to see if anybody had any ideas about where this word came from and why it referred to this image of the emperor. Got an answer today from Scott Paddock. He says it's Shikutz Samayin, and variants are the Hebrew for images of idolatry or detestable abominations, and it appears in Daniel 11 and 12, referring to Antiochus IV defilement and the images, and Yirmiyahu 7 and 16, referring to King Manasseh, his earlier image defilement. It's also used in similar ways in Ezekiel. Well, leave it up to Scott to get to the bottom of that one. Now, we're going to go into some mentions of Yeshua. And first, I want to reiterate to you the Testimonium Flavianum. That is the testimony of Josephus about Jesus from the Antiquities, Antiquities 18, that has been under so much scrutiny all these years. People say, scholars say, oh, it can't be right. It can't be right. He couldn't possibly have been a believer. And here is that testimony as it now stands in your translation of the Greek Josephus. About this time there lived Yashus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a stake, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of Elohim had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. That does sound a little bogus, but a new text of that had been found in Arabic. And when that text was translated, we find an earlier version than that is not so sensational. However, it's more believable. And here's John Meyer's reconstruction of it. At this time there appeared Yashus, a wise man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. I'm sure that you can hear in those readings a great difference. Meyer's translation and reconstruction from the Arabic has debunked some of the interpolations that are in there and just can't be. And with this new finding, we can say with confidence that Yeshua is mentioned in an appropriate fashion in our English versions of the Antiquities and in the Greek version of the same. Bible minimalists, they go after this like crazy because they don't believe he even existed. So if this is to be an authentic reaction, then all their hopes are dashed that they can prove he didn't exist. That seems to be the spirit of this age. And it seems to me there's more than plenty of ascriptions that mention Yeshua that come from the early times, and probably the best is that of Paul. First time that name is mentioned in the New Testament chronologically is in 1 Thessalonians 1:2. And you see the name there. And if you pronounce it correctly, as Paul did, it would be pronounced Yashus. It's these people that haven't studied Greek that do not understand that that was the only way that name could be spelled and pronounced that way. Yashus, an S on the end, because all male names in Greek end with S. So if you hear about Jesus and pagan names and that, well, Paul certainly knew how the name was pronounced, and he writes it down there in exactly the way that it would be written and pronounced correctly in Greek. At that time, there appeared a man, if it proper to call him a man, whose nature and form were human, but whose appearance was more than human, and whose acts were divine. This is from the Slavonic again. He worked wonderful and powerful miracles. Therefore, it is impossible for me to call him a man. Then again, in view of his common nature, let them not call him an angel. Everything, whatever he did by some unseen power, by word and command. Some said of him, our first lawgiver has risen from the dead and has been demonstrating many cures and skills. Others thought that he was sent from Elohim, but he was much opposed to the Torah. He was much opposed to the Torah. Here's the reason. Because he did not observe the Sabbath according to the ancestral custom. Why do you suppose that is? Hold on a minute. Got a deed to do here. There. Why do you suppose he would be accused of not keeping the Torah? Because of his Sabbath practice. Wasn't customary. Well, obviously, Yeshua was on the Zadokite calendar, along with the rest of the Essenes and Nazarenes. Not so hard to figure out anymore. Yet he did nothing unclean, nor used his hands, but worked all he did by word only. Many of the people followed him and listened to his teachings. Many souls were aroused, thinking that by him the Jewish tribes would free themselves from the hands of the Romans. It was his habit, rather, to remain before the city on the Mount of Olives. 150 servants and a multitude of people joined him there. He also gave cures to people free of charge. That does not sound sensational to me at all. Although the one in the Greek Josephus that I read earlier does. The next section, the wonder worker and the controversy, the trial, the judgment. Seeing his power, how by word he did everything he wished, the people invited him to enter the city, to kill Pilate and the Romans and reign over them. But the man who was no man did not care to do so. Later, when news of this came to the leaders of the Jews, they assembled the chief priests and said, we are weak and powerless to oppose the Romans, like a bowstring unstrung. Let us go and inform Pilate what we have heard, so we will be worry-free. For if Pilate hear this from others by and by, he will have our property confiscated, our children exiled, and ourselves slaughtered. So they went and told Pilate, who sent and killed many people, and brought in that wonder worker. After inquiring about him, Pilate understood that he was a good deed doer and not an evildoer, not a rebel nor covetous of kingship, and he released him, for he had cured his dying wife. And that's where that legend comes from. The wonder worker went forth to the usual places, performed his usual acts, and again, as more people gathered around him, he became renowned for his works more than any. The lawyers were struck with jealousy, so they gave Pilate 30 talents so he would kill them. Now, if this writer was following the New Testament, he would not have written any of this stuff. He would have conformed himself to the New Testament. And if this person was a Christian, yes, the New Testament was in circulation then, he would have most certainly followed what the holy books, what he considered the holy books would say. Now, he took the talents and gave them liberty to carry out their wishes themselves. Let me try that again. The lawyers were struck with jealousy, so they gave Pilate 30 talents so he would kill him. He took the talents, that is Pilate, and gave them liberty to carry out their wishes themselves. So Pilate's taking the money here, and giving the Jews the opportunity to do what they wanted. They sought out a suitable time to kill him, for they had given Pilate the 30 talents earlier, so he would give Yeshua up to them. They crucified him against ancestral law, and they greatly defiled him. That's the end of that pericope. But here's a note of confirmation from the historian Tacitus from his Annals 1544, who says, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, was in the reign of Tiberius executed by procurator Pontius Pilate. Let's see, Tacitus, he lived in the 2nd century, I believe. If you ever want something to read that is exciting, go get his annals. They're called the histories. It's very good reading, even today. Exciting. Next section, the temple curtain. Within the temple, the gates were all made of gold, 55 ells high and 16 wide. In front of them, there was a curtain of the same height and width as the gates, of fine oriental linen, studded with jewels, of byssus, which is linen, red silk, and purple, wonderful to see, for it was done with great art. The red silk represented the fire, the byssus the earth, the jewels the air, and the purple the sea, thus corresponding to the 4 elements. There was painted upon it the whole sky and its order, so long as the people believed the curtain was whole. But now it's in a sorry state, since of a sudden it was rent asunder from top to bottom at the time when that benefactor was condemned to death. Oh, we're doing good in time. Almost done. The next section I call the servants of the wonder worker. Again, Claudius sent his officials, Cuspius Fadus and Tiberius Alexander, who, by the way, was the nephew of Pliny Judaicus in Alexandria. It's said of Tiberius Alexander that he gave up the Jewish faith entirely and went to paganism. And I suppose that was part of the deal here as to how he could get these high offices that he did. Fadus and Alexander. Tiberius Alexander is mentioned in the Acts as the governor, and I'm going to guess that's about Acts 21. To the 21, yeah. 21 or 24, I get them mixed up. If anyone departed from the letter of the law and was denounced to the teachers of the law, he was then punished, banished, or sent to Caesar. At this time, there appeared many servants of the previously described wonder worker, telling the people about their master, that he was still alive, although he had died. And they said, he will free you from slavery. Many of the people listened to them and paid attention to their instructions, and not because of their fame. They were from the lowly, for some were sail makers, some sandal makers, some were manual workers. And here we find an interpolation that says some were fishermen. Now we know that's an interpolation. We don't hear sail makers or sandal makers in the New Testament. But these performed wonderful signs, whatever they wanted to do. Now listen here. The grateful governors, considering the subversion of the people, planned with the scribe to lay hands on them and destroy them, lest a small matter be not small when in fullness it becomes great. But they were ashamed and terrified by such signs and said, so great wonders do not happen by magic. If they do not come by Elohim's forethought, they will soon be unmasked. But the governors gave them authority to go about freely. Later, being pestered by them, they let them go, some to Caesar, some to Antioch, others to distant lands, for composing an investigation of the matter. Now I turn over to Suetonius now in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, the 12 Caesars, with just one line. It kind of follows up on that last part. And that one line is, Claudius banished all Jews from Rome who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. Hey, we could refurbish the entire store if we went to all these different sources and put them in chronological order, I suppose. So the Slavonic Josephus includes numerous additions to the Greek versions, yet much less in its entirety. It's as though the Slavonic is the bones and the Greek the flesh hanging upon them. And I forgot to mention that in the Greek Josephus, the one that we read, there are many characters mentioned in there that correspond with New Testament characters. But it seems to me that these correspondences, people don't want to bring them out. For instance, there's a correspondence in there to Simon Peter. You probably know the story. There was a leader of an assembly who was constantly giving King Agrippa trouble about his lifestyle. And King Agrippa actually invited this Simon in to his house to witness how he lived his life. And Simon stayed there. And when he left, it says he left with many gifts. There's a couple of occurrences of Paul in there. He's called Saulos. That would be his Greek name. Saulos. And a brother of his, which by the way is named Costobarus or Costobar, which was the name, as we understand, of Paul's grandfather. Costobar is just too much like Barnabas, I'm thinking. In these two mentions of Saulos and Bar, Josephus writes that they were the leaders of a gang of what we call terrorists there. They were the leaders of a gang of terrorists, and they got away with it because they were relatives of the kings. They were Herodians. Eisenman wrote a piece about Paul as Herodian, which you ought to read, because Paul certainly was a Herodian, and Robert also discovered Paul's genealogy that takes him back in 2 generations to Salome, the sister of Herod the Great. So look, we're seeing in that, I ought to go and get that maybe next time. We're seeing in that pericope Paul from a different point of view, that is, this murder and mayhem that he was causing, that was condoned by some was not condoned by Josephus, who calls them terrorists. And I might add that in the Josephus, we have James in there, and the death of James, the brother of Yeshua, and the Paul passages are right like on either side of the James passages, James death passages. It's like, and they stoned him to death, and then one paragraph, and then the next paragraph, and Saulos and Barcostus or Costabaras were doing this and that. It's very interesting that they would be somewhere right around the place that James was spoken of. Anyway, that is the end of this presentation. Is anybody left here? I'm wondering if there might, oh, there's Scott. I think that's Scott. I'm glad you're here. I thank you again for that timely note on Semea. Are there any comments or questions? I would like to hear your comments while I'm studying how old I'm getting in Zoom. Nothing? All right. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you would please, before we go, would you go out to the chat and log in? Tell me who's here so I'll know for next time. Would you do that? I'll sing the Jeopardy theme if you will. Thank you.
Hey, are you going to post the notes of this?
Thank you. Yes, I will.
Cool.
Let me put it on the, can I, yes, I can put a file in. Dropbox, your computer, okay. And I scarfed a few classical pictures off the web. Again, if you're interested in this and you actually want the books, just let me know and I'll send them over to you. I was looking for this for 20 years. I mean it. It was out there, but I couldn't get access to it. Let's see. Where are you? Oh, here it is. Okay. And if you find errors, which you certainly will, if they're big ones, let me know. Because I don't want to pass stuff out that's erroneous, although I don't mind putting my own opinion in or your own opinion. Any feedback, please do get in touch with me. Let me give you my email address if you don't have it.
The Slavonic version that you were reading from,
Yeah.
what do you think the date-wise, the provenance is again?
The earliest text itself goes back to 1486.
Right, I remember that part.
Yeah, but they can't guess. There's like 30 different manuscripts.
Yeah.
They're all vastly different. In this lesser book, Leeming book, all the variants are in there. What I chose when I put this together were the most possible variants. There are some in there that was, obvious forgeries. So all we know is that the assumption that these are the Aramaic Josephus
Okay,
that were
thank
translated into
Cyrillic.
Slavonic. And there's also the matter of, says file doesn't exist. Can you not download that?
No, I've just clicked on it and it says file find in folder. I click on it and it says this file does not exist.
Did anybody else try to download that file?
Yeah, I have it. It downloaded fine for me. Sorry.
Send one over to him, will you?
Sure, I will. I'll
All
email.
right.
Thanks.
The last thing I mentioned now, as time's up, there's also a curious text that's known as Josephon. Josephon, that has an affinity with this Slavonic Josephus that I've just started looking into. I've known about the text for a long time, but again, almost impossible to find. This world is opening up on these texts. It's like on the internet, the ground is opening again, and some like this one, this Leeming. I mean, that you can buy that text for somewhere between $500 and $700. Nobody can do that, but there is a library law that a text that's too expensive to buy and one that's not circulated has to be able to be had. So you have leave to use a copy machine on those kind of texts. And I do have the written statute of that law, if anybody would like that. Somebody asked me for that the other day, but I forgot who. All right. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
I
That was
really appreciate it.